What would you do if every single car belonging to your HOA vanished overnight, while you stood on your porch, coffee in hand, watching them scream your name? I remember that morning with a clarity that still sends a shiver down my spine. The sun wasn't even fully up yet, but the neighborhood was already alive with panic. Doors slammed, voices echoed, and shadows of confused residents darted across the pavement like frantic ghosts. You could hear the sharp tones of emergency calls being made, the word stolen thrown around like a weapon. And right in the center of it all stood Karen Mitchell, our HOA president, her voice rising above everyone else as she demanded to know who had dared to attack the community. I leaned against my porch railing, the wood cool beneath my palms, and watched them scramble. Their confusion wasn't surprising. Their anger wasn't new. What struck me most was how none of them seemed to pause and ask the real question. What had pushed things this far? They just assumed chaos had found them unfairly, as if their own actions couldn't possibly have consequences. Karen paced the street with that familiar mix of entitlement and fury, shouting orders at anyone who made eye contact with her. She kept yelling my name, insisting someone drag me outside, insisting I answer for what had happened. But for once I felt no fear, just an unsettling calm, the kind that comes after months of silently drowning. Because this moment, this unbelievable scene unfolding at sunrise, didn't come from revenge. It came from survival. And I don't expect anyone to understand that yet. Not until they hear what was taken from me long before those tow trucks ever arrived. I had spent months being worn down piece by piece, my rights stripped from me in the name of community rules, my property claimed without permission, my dignity trampled by people who thought titles gave them absolute power. By the time this morning came, I wasn't trying to win. I was just trying to get my life back. Watching them now, running in circles, demanding answers, calling the police as if the world revolved around their convenience. It almost felt surreal. My heart should have been pounding. My hands should have been shaking, but instead I felt something different. Something heavier. Exhaustion. Betrayal. A quiet clarity that had taken months to form. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt done. And I want you to ask yourself something. If someone took something from you, something they had no right to touch, how far would you go to reclaim your peace? Would you fight back? Would you walk away? Or would you wait, like I did, until the moment came when the truth could finally be forced into the light? Because that's what this morning was. Not a victory, a revelation. As the shouting grew louder and Karen finally spotted me standing there, her eyes widened with a mix of rage and disbelief. She pointed at me, like she had finally found the villain in her story. But she had no idea what the real story was. Not yet. To understand why this street is empty, you need to see the day they stole something I didn't even know I'd lose. Ever bought a home and ignored a tiny detail, only to learn that detail might destroy everything you own? Because that's exactly how my nightmare began. After that chaotic morning when the HOA screamed my name, I kept replaying the moment I moved into this neighborhood. The moment everything still felt new, simple, and full of promise. I remember holding the deed in my hands, skimming through the paperwork like any excited homeowner would. Nestled between legal descriptions and parcel numbers was this odd note. A narrow strip of land running along the cul-de-sac was technically mine. A private access road. A leftover portion from an old development plan. I didn't think much of it. Honestly, I barely understood it. It just felt like a quirky footnote in a pile of documents I was too happy to question. The day I moved in, the house smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. The air was warm, the street quiet, and for a moment I believed I'd found the kind of peace people chase their whole lives. That's when I first met her, Karen Mitchell. She walked toward me with a smile so wide it felt practiced, eyes sharp enough to cut through drywall. Her voice was sugary, polite, rehearsed. She introduced herself as the HOA president, then immediately corrected where I placed my trash bin. At the time, I brushed it off. Every neighborhood had someone like her, right? A little too proud of their authority, a little too involved in everyone's lives. I told myself it was harmless. For a while it was. The HOA sent a few reminders, a few mild warnings about lawn height and paint touch-ups. Irritating, sure, but manageable. Nothing I couldn't shrug off. Karen always walked around with a clipboard like it was an extension of her arm. She'd greet people with that tight smile, jot something down, and vanish around the corner. I figured she was just overly dedicated, maybe even lonely. I never imagined she was studying the neighborhood like a map she wanted to redraw. But looking back now, I realized the warning signs were there. Little comments during meetings about community expansion, little hints about shared assets and unified control. The board would talk about making the neighborhood more cohesive, more organized. At the time, it sounded like typical HOA fluff. Nothing worth losing sleep over. I had no idea they were eyeing the one thing I'd forgotten I even owned, the road beneath my feet. Life was peaceful then. Quiet dinners on the porch, evenings laughing with neighbors, mornings where I didn't wake up fearing another letter in my mailbox. I was naive, and maybe that's why the betrayal hit so deep when it finally came. Because one day, after a long shift at work, I turned onto my street, expecting the comfort of home. Instead, my headlights landed on something that made my stomach drop. There, bolted into the asphalt of my private road, was a fresh white sign. HOA property. Private. Authorized use only. And in that moment, everything changed. Imagine walking up to your own driveway and seeing someone else's name on it, claiming your land as theirs. What would you do? Because that was exactly the question staring me in the face as I stood under the fading evening light, looking at the bold white letters screwed into the asphalt of my own road. My road. A piece of land I hadn't cared about until the moment someone tried to take it from me. I felt my chest tighten as if the sign itself were pressing down on my lungs. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was quiet, sharp, and it sank in slowly like a blade being pushed beneath the skin. I marched straight to Karen's house, the sign still burning behind my eyelids. When she opened the door, she looked almost pleased, as if she'd been expecting me. She wore that same manufactured smile, the one that always seemed glued in place until you questioned her authority. I pointed toward the road and demanded an explanation. Her expression didn't change. She simply crossed her arms and said, "Oh, that. The board decided the road has always been common property. We're just updating the signage." Her words hit like a slap. I told her the road was on my deed, clearly marked, legally described. But she waved her hand dismissively as if the law were nothing more than an outdated suggestion. "Your deed must be inaccurate," she said. "The HOA attorney believes it's a clerical error. We're correcting it for the community's sake." The audacity left me speechless. Outdated. Clerical error. Since when could a neighborhood committee override county records? I felt disbelief melting into something darker. Controlled anger, the kind that simmers just below the surface. Karen kept talking, using phrases like community standards, shared responsibility, and unified ownership, as if rehearsed. Every sentence was meant to make me feel small, outnumbered, powerless. And the truth was, I did feel powerless, at least for a moment. There she stood, backed by a board that signed papers I hadn't seen, quoting policies I never agreed to. It was the first time I realized the imbalance between us. She had an entire organization behind her, and I had a deed I thought was enough. I walked home that night feeling like the ground beneath my feet no longer belonged to me, as if someone had quietly rewritten reality while I wasn't looking. The next morning, the real attack began. Letters started showing up in my mailbox. Notices about unauthorized use of common property, warnings about obstruction, and thinly veiled threats about potential assessments. Paperwork stacked up fast, each page dripping with false authority. Every envelope felt heavier than the last. The HOA wasn't just claiming my road. They were declaring war through ink and intimidation. I tried to shake it off. But every time I passed that sign, the anger boiled again. They had taken something without permission and expected me to simply accept it. I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a takeover. And then, just when I thought they couldn't push any further, I opened my mailbox one afternoon and found a new letter, one unlike the others. The HOA had sent me a reclassification notice, boldly declaring that my private road was now officially adopted as HOA property. What if every time you opened your mailbox, you felt like you were being hunted? That's what my life became after the reclassification notice. It didn't come alone. It brought an army, an endless parade of envelopes stamped with the HOA logo like a brand meant to mark me as an outsider. I used to open my mailbox without thinking. Now, just touching the cold metal handle made my stomach twist. I knew exactly what waited inside. Accusations, threats, and fines disguised as community enforcement. The letters multiplied overnight. The first accused me of obstructing common property. The second claimed I was hindering community function. The third warned of potential disciplinary action. Each one grew bolder, more aggressive, dripping with the certainty that I couldn't fight back. Some fines were for things I'd never done. Others were for violations that didn't even exist. They wanted me overwhelmed, buried under paperwork until I surrendered. But the letters weren't the worst part. It was the way the neighborhood suddenly shifted around me, like the entire street had been coached on what to think. Neighbors who used to wave now whispered in clusters when I walked by. A few even came up to me, gently suggesting that I stop causing trouble. One woman said, "Karen says you're trying to take the road away from us." "Why, Mike? Why would you do that to your community?" The look in her eyes wasn't anger. It was pity. Pity for me, because she believed their version of the story. Karen was brilliant at manipulation, I'll give her that. She spread lies like wildfire, and the board members, loyal to their titles, fanned the flames. Soon, parents didn't want their kids near my driveway. People stopped inviting me to neighborhood events. Conversations cut off when I approached. It felt like invisible walls had formed around my house, squeezing tighter every day. Then the parking harassment began. Cars started appearing right against my property line, sometimes blocking parts of my driveway. Board members parked their vehicles along the narrow road I owned, as if staking their claim like intruders planting flags on my soil. A few residents even told me, "Karen said we're allowed to park here now. It's HOA property." Every time I corrected them, they shrugged. That's not what we heard. The combination of isolation, intimidation, and constant harassment began eating at me. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake listening to the hum of cars outside, wondering if the HOA had planned their next move. My home stopped feeling like a refuge and started feeling like a battlefield. Even the silence felt hostile. At some point, I realized this wasn't incompetence. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't an administrative error. This was a coordinated effort to break me down. Karen wanted control of the road, and she decided the easiest way to get it was to make my life so unbearable that I'd hand it over just to breathe again. But the thing about pushing someone into a corner is that eventually they stop backing up. One evening, after a day filled with more warnings and staged complaints, I stepped outside for air. The sun was low, casting an orange glow across the pavement. That's when I saw it. Bright, fresh spray paint cutting across my land. Lines, arrows, new boundaries drawn by someone who had no right to touch a single inch of my property. And that was the moment I knew the HOA had no intention of stopping. Have you ever uncovered proof so powerful it made you shake? Not from fear, but from how wrong everyone else had been. That's what happened the day I walked into the county records office, carrying a folder full of HOA threats that had pushed me past my breaking point. After seeing those spray-painted boundary lines on my property, something inside me snapped. I needed the truth. Not rumors, not letters, not Karen's rehearsed explanations. I needed the cold, unchangeable records buried in county archives. The building smelled like old paper and dust, the kind of place where time seems to slow. I approached the clerk, explained I needed parcel maps and recorded plats for my property. She typed for a moment, then slid a stack of documents toward me. "These are all tied to your parcel," she said. I sat at a long wooden table, heart pounding as I flipped through the pages. And then I saw it. A bold black outline marking my land, and the narrow road running alongside it. Not as shared property, not as community property, not as an easement for the HOA, but as a completely separate, privately owned parcel. Parcel, my road. For a moment, I didn't breathe. The proof was right there. Official, recorded, stamped, indisputable. The HOA hadn't just been wrong, they had been lying. Every fine, every threat, every smug comment from Karen, they all crumbled in an instant. Relief washed through me like cool water, but right behind it came something hotter, sharper, fury. They knew, or at least they should have known, and yet they had pushed forward, hoping I'd cave before I ever checked the truth. I hired a licensed surveyor the next morning. I needed more than paper. I needed physical, verifiable proof on the ground. As he walked the property with his equipment, the beeping of his GPS unit echoed between the houses. He drove bright orange stakes into the soil with confident strikes, each one landing exactly where the county map said it would. When he was done, the road was clearly, undeniably outlined as mine, while the HOA's spray-painted fantasy boundaries were exposed for what they were. Fiction. Standing there, surrounded by neon flags marking the truth, I felt a strange mix of vindication and disbelief. For months I had been treated like an intruder on my own land. Now, science, law, and history all stood on my side. I gathered every document, every map, every photo, and packed them neatly into a binder. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was ready to confront them. The next HOA meeting felt different before I even stepped inside. Karen stood at the front with her usual posture, chin raised, smile tight. I walked in holding my binder, feeling the weight of every piece of evidence inside it. Neighbors murmured, sensing something brewing. I waited for my moment, ready to lay everything out and finally force them to face reality. But before I could speak, Karen lifted her hand, silencing the room. Her smile widened, cold and confident. "We've already filed our claim," she said. "How do you fight people bold enough to threaten foreclosure over land that isn't even theirs?" That question echoed through my mind over and over after Karen's smug announcement at the HOA meeting. I walked out gripping my binder of evidence so tightly my knuckles turned white. They hadn't just ignored the truth, they'd doubled down. And the very next morning, their next attack arrived in a crisp white envelope taped to my front door like a warning from an enemy camp. Inside was a notice of outstanding dues and assessments, claiming I owed thousands of dollars for road maintenance, community access, and legal fees. Attached was a threat I never imagined I'd read in connection to my own name. Failure to pay could result in a lien placed against my property, my home, my sanctuary, the one place that was supposed to be untouchable. I stared at the letter, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. They weren't just trying to take the road now. They were coming after the house sitting on it. More letters followed, each one more aggressive than the last. Legal language, bold fonts, red-stamped warnings. They wanted me scared. They wanted me cornered. They wanted me unstable enough to cave. And the worst part? It was working. I could feel the pressure in my chest every time I bent down to open the mailbox, like the metal door itself was a trap waiting to snap shut. Meanwhile, the narrative Karen spread through the neighborhood was poisoning everything around me. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Some crossed the street when they saw me coming. Others whispered loud enough for me to hear. "He's trying to tear the community apart. He's costing us money. He's bringing legal trouble. He's dangerous." Dangerous, like I was the threat. Like I was the one rewriting property lines in the dead of night. Fear and anger battled inside me constantly. I was terrified of losing my home, but I was furious that people who barely knew me believed lies so easily. I'd always thought truth won eventually, but I was learning that lies traveled faster and hit harder. For a while, I tried responding to every letter, every accusation, every rumor. I thought if I just explained myself enough, someone would listen. Someone would understand. Someone would see the truth. But each response only seemed to fuel the fire. The HOA wanted me reactive. They wanted me emotional. They wanted me exhausted. And one night, sitting in a living room lit only by the glow of another threatening letter, I realized something. I couldn't win by playing defense. They had a system, a flawed one, a corrupt one, but it was still a system. If I wanted to survive this, I needed a strategy. I needed a plan they wouldn't see coming. That realization hit me like a spark in a dark room. And just as the thought began to form, a sudden argument outside shattered the quiet. Tires screeched. Voices rose. Someone yelled, angry and impatient about parking on the road. I froze, because in that moment, listening to that argument, I felt an idea taking shape. An idea so bold it made my pulse quicken. What would you do if you discovered the law actually gave you full power over the people tormenting you? That question hit me the night I overheard that argument on the road. Their shouting wasn't just noise. It was a trigger, a reminder of everything the HOA was doing wrong, everything they weren't entitled to do, and everything they assumed I was too weak to challenge. But as I listened, a realization formed like a quiet spark in the back of my mind. Maybe I didn't have to fight their lies anymore. Maybe I just had to enforce the truth. I went inside, sat at my computer, and started researching. Not casually, not like someone browsing answers. I dove into state statutes, property laws, towing regulations, and legal rights tied to private roads. The deeper I read, the faster my heart beat, because the law wasn't on the HOA's side at all. It was on mine. My property wasn't just a strip of asphalt. It was a privately owned parcel with full rights granted to me as the legal title holder. That meant something powerful. Under state towing laws, a private property owner could enforce parking rules, including restricting access entirely, as long as signage and legal steps were followed. I wasn't required to tolerate trespassing or unauthorized parking. And since the HOA had no recorded easement granting them access, not legally, not officially, they were violating my rights every time they parked a single car on that road. All the threats they sent me, all the fines, all the intimidation, none of it held legal weight. But the authority I suddenly realized I had, that was real. Empowerment crept through me like a slow-building fire. For the first time in months, I didn't feel hunted. I felt equipped, but I needed confirmation. Ironclad confirmation. So the next morning, I booked an appointment with a property attorney. Sitting across from him in a quiet office, I laid out everything: the plat maps, the survey results, the HOA notices, the bogus reclassification claim. He reviewed it all carefully, flipping through the documents with a growing look of disbelief. "Mike," he finally said, "you own that road outright. There's no recorded easement giving the HOA authority. They've got no legal claim." He leaned back, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "If they're parking on it without your permission, that's trespassing. And yes, you have the right to tow." Hearing those words felt like breathing for the first time in months. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining the injustice. I had been pushed, cornered, and bullied, but I wasn't powerless. I left his office with a clarity I hadn't felt since the day I moved in. If the HOA wanted a fight based on rules, then I was going to use the real rules, not their invented ones. Quietly, carefully, I began to prepare. I drafted legally compliant towing signs. I contacted a local towing company and inquired about private property enforcement contracts. They walked me through everything: documentation, proof of ownership, required signage placement. I followed every rule, every step, every regulation to the letter. The day I went to finalize the contract, the tow yard smelled like oil, metal, and cold air. The manager, a broad-shouldered man with grease-stained hands, looked over my documents, then met my eyes with a knowing expression. "You sure you're ready to burn this bridge for good?" he asked. And the weight of that question settled deep inside me, because I knew the moment I answered, nothing in the neighborhood would ever be the same. How many times should someone warn you before the consequences become your fault? That question echoed through my head the day I installed the towing signs along my private road. Each sign gleamed under the afternoon sun, bold, clear, legally compliant, and impossible to misunderstand. Private property, unauthorized vehicles will be towed at owner's expense. I drilled them into the ground myself, feeling each vibration up my arms like the steady drumbeat of a plan finally coming to life. This wasn't revenge. It was protection, a line drawn where the HOA had crossed one too many times. Once the signs were in place, I sent the HOA a formal notice. Not a message, not a complaint, but a documented letter with the survey attached, the plat map highlighted, and a simple statement. The road is private property. Unauthorized parking is prohibited and will result in towing. I mailed a copy, emailed another, and even hand-delivered one to the HOA office drop box. I wanted zero confusion, zero excuses. They would know exactly what was coming if they kept pushing. But Karen didn't back off. She doubled down. Later that same week, a neighborhood email bulletin went out. I remember reading it twice, my jaw tightening. "Residents are advised to ignore the unauthorized signs placed by Mr. Harris," she wrote. "The road is common property, and parking remains permitted." Unauthorized signs. That's what she called the legally compliant markers on land she didn't own. And with her message, she encouraged the entire neighborhood to pretend reality didn't exist. Some residents fell for it completely. They continued parking on the road like nothing had changed, dismissing my signs with amused smirks. Others hesitated, unsure who to believe. A few even pulled me aside quietly and said, "Mike, are you sure about this? I don't want my car towed." Their caution made sense. Their confusion didn't. I had given them evidence, literal proof, and yet Karen's authority still held weight for them. It amazed me how easily people trusted the loudest voice instead of the truest one. But underneath all the frustration and disbelief, there was a strange calm settling over me. This was the quiet before the storm, the stillness that comes when you know something big is about to break. I had done everything right. I followed the law. I gave warnings. I gave notice. The next move wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to them. And Karen, blinded by her own certainty, made that move faster than I expected. A glossy HOA newsletter arrived in every mailbox the following week. I unfolded it at my kitchen counter, expecting more propaganda. But instead, I found something else entirely, an announcement for a large community celebration, complete with food trucks, speeches, and games. Attendance was highly encouraged. Parking, the newsletter proudly declared, would be available along the main road. My road, and at the bottom, in bold letters, it read, "Feel free to park anywhere along the road. Ignore the signs. They are not valid." A cold, electric clarity ran through me. They had just set the stage for everything that would happen next. What would you feel watching the people who tormented you walk straight into the trap they built for themselves? I asked myself that question over and over as the night of the community event arrived. By sunset, the neighborhood buzzed with excitement, laughter spilling from lawns, music echoing from portable speakers, the smell of grilled food drifting through the warm air. And along my private road, a parade of cars, not just residents, but guests, board members, and of course, Karen's shiny new SUV parked dead center like a crown jewel. Every inch of asphalt was covered. The signs I'd installed stood tall and obvious, illuminated by streetlights, but ignored as if they were invisible. I walked the length of the road slowly, breathing in the moment. The night felt thick with energy, anticipation, tension, and something else I hadn't felt in months: control. I pulled out my phone and began documenting everything. Every car, every license plate, every angle, date-stamped photos, Wide shots, close-ups, footage of the signs, the survey markers, all of it. If this went to court, which I fully expected, it would be undeniable. By the time I reached the end of the road, my hands were steady in a way they never were when opening HOA mail. I looked back at the glowing string of parked vehicles, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear pressing on my chest. I felt justice, quiet, steady, buzzing under my skin like low-voltage electricity. When the moment finally felt right, I stepped aside, dialed the towing company, and said the words I never thought I'd have to say. "You can send them." The manager didn't hesitate. "Be there in 10." And he was. The first tow truck rolled in with flashing amber lights cutting through the darkness. The hum of the engine vibrated through the pavement. Chains clinked. Metal hooks scraped. Tires lifted off the ground one by one. And for a moment, I could barely breathe. Not from nerves, but from sheer adrenaline. This wasn't revenge. This was enforcement. This was months of being bullied finally meeting the wall of actual law. Another truck arrived, then another. Soon, the quiet residential street sounded like a construction zone. Diesel engines rumbling, hydraulics hissing, chains tightening. Car after car disappeared into the night. SUVs, pickups, sedans, gone. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The stretch of road that had been overflowing with vehicles was slowly returning to the empty, peaceful space it had always been. My space. And the whole time, the community event raged on just yards away. Music drowned out the distant clatter. Laughter masked the sound of metal shifting. They had no idea what was happening. The very people who mocked my warnings, who called me dramatic, who believed Karen's every word were inside the clubhouse, in the glow of warm lights, completely unaware their night was about to end with chaos they had created for themselves. When the last SUV lifted onto the final truck, I stepped back and exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Relief washed through me, powerful enough to make my hands tremble. Justice wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It looked exactly like this: me, standing on my own property, watching the law finally work the way it was supposed to. Then, just as the final tow truck eased forward, the clubhouse door slammed open. A voice tore through the night, shocked, panicked, disbelieving. "The cars are gone." And suddenly the storm I'd been waiting for finally broke loose. Ever been so sure you'd be blamed, only to watch the law turn against your enemies instead? That's exactly what it felt like in the minutes after the first scream tore across the clubhouse lawn. People poured out of the building in a wave of confusion, their voices overlapping, their footsteps pounding the pavement as they rushed toward the now empty stretch of my private road. Flashlights flickered wildly. Someone shouted, "Call the police." Another yelled, "Who did this?" And at the center of the chaos, Karen appeared like a storm cloud, charging toward me with fury burning in her eyes. "You!" she screamed, pointing as if her finger could pin me to the pavement. "You stole our cars. Every single one. You're finished, Mike. Do you hear me? Finished." Within seconds, residents formed a circle around me. Some looked angry. Others looked afraid. Most didn't know what to think, but they all waited for the sirens. And they came. 2 patrol cars rolled into the neighborhood, lights flashing silently in the darkness. The officers stepped out, calm and controlled, while everyone else buzzed like shaken bees. Karen lunged at them first, her voice shrill with desperation. "Arrest him. He took the entire community's cars. This is criminal theft." I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there and let the truth settle around me like a shield. When one of the officers approached, I held out the folder I'd prepared days earlier. The deed, the survey, the documentation of the signs, the photos and videos I'd taken before the first tow truck even arrived. "Sir, you're saying this road belongs to you?" the officer asked. "Legally recorded as my private property," I replied. "No easements. No shared rights. The HOA was notified in writing to stop parking here. They ignored every warning." He flipped through the binder, Slowly, methodically, the neighborhood watched in tight-lipped silence. Even Karen's smugness faltered as he traced the property lines with his finger, then examined the photos of cars lined up beside clearly posted towing warnings. It felt like the entire night held its breath. Finally, the officer looked up. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "based on this documentation, he acted within his rights as the property owner. These aren't criminal matters. They're civil, and your association may actually be liable." You could have heard a pin drop. Karen's face froze, then twisted as she tried to form words that wouldn't come. A few residents stepped back from her. Someone whispered, "Wait, we parked illegally?" Another murmured, "Did she know about this?" Karen tried to regain control. "That road is HOA property," she snapped. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Do you have recorded documents to prove that?" Karen hesitated, just long enough for everyone to realize the truth. We filed a claim," she stammered. "A claim isn't proof," the officer said firmly. "And encouraging residents to park on property not owned by the HOA is a serious issue." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" He closed the binder and handed it back to me. "It means, ma'am, if you continue directing people to park here, you might be the one facing consequences." And just like that, the balance of power shifted. If you listened closely, you could hear the HOA falling apart. One whisper, one resignation, one apology at a time. It didn't happen all at once. Power rarely collapses in a single moment. It unravels slowly, thread by thread, until the person clutching it finds they're holding nothing at all. After the police left that night, the neighborhood didn't just go quiet. It shifted. The glare that once pointed at me turned inward toward the HOA, toward Karen, toward the people who had been shouting the loudest without ever checking the truth. By morning, the community group chat, usually filled with cheerful updates and passive-aggressive reminders, had become a battleground. Residents were furious. Some demanded answers. Others wanted refunds for towing fees. A few, braver than the rest, outright asked, "Why did you tell us to ignore his signs? Why didn't you check who owned the road?" The whispers began spreading like cracks across old plaster. Small at first, then widening, deepening, impossible to ignore. That afternoon, I watched from my porch as two board members walked briskly to Karen's house. They stayed for less than 10 minutes. When they left, their faces were pale, their movements stiff. Within hours, an email hit our inboxes. The HOA treasurer and secretary were resigning effective immediately. No explanations, no formal statements, just gone. Their exits felt like the first domino falling. Then came the attorney, or rather, the absence of one. Residents reported that the HOA's lawyer, who Karen claimed had validated her interpretation of the road's ownership, had quietly informed several homeowners that he had not advised the HOA to claim the road and would no longer comment on unverified assertions made by board members. In other words, he wasn't going down with her. He was stepping back, distancing himself from the fire she'd started, letting it burn her alone. Meanwhile, I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. I drafted a formal demand letter, calm, professional, backed by evidence. It outlined the harassment, the false claims, the threats, the misuse of authority, and the financial damages caused by their attempted takeover. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a reminder that the law wasn't a toy, and I wasn't someone they could intimidate into silence. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had the upper hand. Later that week, something unexpected happened. When I stepped outside one morning, the fake HOA property, private sign that had once mocked me was gone. Not moved, not damaged, completely removed. Only 2 broken screw fragments remained in the asphalt, like traces of a lie being peeled away. No one admitted to taking it down. No HOA announcement followed. It vanished quietly, like guilt dissolving before daylight. But the silence that came afterward wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, tense, full of unfinished business. You could feel the neighborhood holding its breath, waiting to see what Karen would do next, or whether she would finally admit defeat. And then, Just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops that evening, there was a knock at my door. Soft, hesitant, nothing like the confidence she once carried. When I opened it, Karen stood there, eyes tired, posture deflated. "Please," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk." When your enemy finally hands you the apology they swore they'd never give, what do you feel? Revenge or peace? That question echoed through my chest the moment I opened the door and saw Karen standing there, stripped of the confidence she once wore like armor. She wasn't holding a clipboard this time. No notes, no threats, no fake smiles. Just a thin folder clutched in shaking hands and eyes that couldn't quite meet mine. For a moment, I simply stared, unsure if this was another trick or the moment everything finally cracked open. "I need to talk," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. We stepped inside and she sat on the edge of my couch like someone waiting for a verdict. She took a slow breath, then opened the folder. Inside were pages I never expected to see from her. Papers acknowledging the road was legally mine, a withdrawal of all fines and claims, and a settlement offer. But what struck me most wasn't the documents. It was the apology letter sitting on top. Handwritten, shaky, and painfully honest. "I made mistakes," she said quietly. "Too many. I pushed too far. The board wants to settle this. We want this to end." For months she had dismissed me, mocked me, weaponized my neighbors against me. And now she sat across from me waiting for my terms. And I had them ready. "I'll accept your settlement," I said. "But only if the apology is sent to every resident. Not just me. I want all claims formally withdrawn. I want the HOA bylaws corrected to prevent this from happening to anyone else. And I want your resignation." She didn't argue. She didn't fight. She simply nodded, shoulders sinking with the weight of consequences long overdue. "I'll sign whatever you need," she murmured. "I'm stepping down." And she did. Within a week, the entire neighborhood received a letter acknowledging the HOA's wrongdoing. My road was no longer disputed, no longer a battleground, no longer a weapon used against me. It was officially, undeniably, publicly recognized as mine. The liens, threats, and false claims were dissolved like steam fading into cold air. Karen resigned quietly. No speech, no farewell. Just another email in the inbox and a for sale sign on her lawn a month later. What surprised me most was how quickly the neighborhood began to heal once her grip loosened. A new HOA president stepped in. Someone reasonable. Someone who valued communication over control. Neighbors who once avoided me started waving again. Some even apologized, admitting they'd believed whatever Karen told them because it was easier than questioning her authority. And me? For the first time in months, I felt the tension melt from my home. The road that once symbolized conflict now felt like reclaimed space. A reminder that rights only matter if you defend them, inch by inch, document by document, truth by truth. To everyone watching this, let me ask you, what would you have done in my place? Would you have fought back? Would you have let it go? If you believe in standing up for what's yours, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this story, because you never know who might need to hear it. But here's the thing. I thought this victory meant the fight was over, until something even bigger happened. And that story? That's for next time.